Nice to meet everybody. Thanks so much for having me on. Basically, I've been invited to speak because of experience that I've had in disaster recovery, particularly economic recoveries after disaster. And I think it's really important to have these conversations right now because obviously climate change is throwing a lot at us at the moment. But also, I've been concerned a little bit over the past year or two because COVID, especially in the economic realm, I think gave us a false sense of security. A lot of communities responded really well to it, but have felt like, okay, we understand how to deal with economic disruption, especially, and so we've got it. And I would say that. COVID is really a starter disaster. It's not anywhere close to what you see with a major forest fire or a major flood, earthquake, etc. What we've seen with Lytton and Merritt, as well as some other communities that have been hit hard in the past, they are overwhelmed with multiple layers of catastrophe. And so I think there needs to be more thought and more work done by municipalities to prepare for this kind of thing. When I think about economic disruption, the term I like to put it into is really a disruption of lifelines. The majority of everything that we access every day for our lives come usually from small businesses or somewhere in the economy. Our food, our clothes, even our shelter is provided by construction companies. There are so many things that we depend on that come from the private sector. And so when you're thinking about rebuilding a community or just, after a response, getting people to come back after they've evacuated, you have to think about, well, what are the core businesses that people rely on? So, your grocery stores and pharmacies and daycares and all kinds of other places that employ those people. You need, all those things to come back online. And, typically, communities don't have plans for that. They don't have an economic resilience or an economic recovery plan that they have gone through and developed before a disaster happens. A lot of times they just leave it until when the event happens, and it's strange because we put so much emphasis on emergency management planning and making sure that we're ready, to get people out of the community or put out the fires or rescue people. But then when it comes to these important lifelines, we don't have plans. And so, over the past few years, I've been working at Simon Fraser University as well. And, we've been working with 8 communities in the Kootenays to develop economic resilience plans, work with, all levels of government and the private sector and even residents to sort of structure, well, how would you actually do that kind of recovery work? Who would do what? Who would be in charge of, business technical assistance? Who would be in charge with, finding locations for businesses to exist while there's rebuilding of your downtown core, all kinds of issues. And some are very successful planning sessions and some aren't. It really depends on the community and how devoted they are, but they're definitely very important for communities to have plans like that that will prepare them just to respond to the loss of lifelines in the economy. Some other things I just wanted to talk about is, like when we look at recovery, how do we actually go about doing recovery? So say if in one of your communities you've got something going on right now or something happens in the next month or two, how would you start to think about, well, what's the immediate steps I would take on the recovery side? And I think that there's 2 things that you think about with businesses. You think about them geographically and sectorally. So, geographically, where are your clusters of businesses and, like a main street or strip malls, et cetera, where are these businesses located and how do you direct attention to them? But then there's a different layer where you're thinking sectoral. So all of your agriculture businesses or all of your, daycare businesses or restaurants, there are all these other layers that require different strategies and different ways of thinking about recovery, different resources that these businesses need. And so normally when you start an economic recovery, you're going to want to think about, well, who am I targeting and then how do I do it that's different than targeting other types of businesses. if I were to break it up into phases, like the emergency management cycle, I would say that you start out with an evaluation. You get out there and find out who's been harmed and how bad is it. What state is your economy in? Usually, I think it's good to have relationships with universities that have like business programs. So because a lot of times students will love to go out and go door to door and knock on these businesses' doors and find out, what the challenges are. Another way to do that is to use your ESS or NEP programs, like Jeff was describing with Quadra. A lot of those folks love to be given clipboards and deployed into the neighborhood so that they can go out and ask questions and find out that kind of stuff. Once you sort of evaluated the situation well, then going into some immediate supports, getting businesses, immediate grants, loans, technical assistance, just so they can kind of figure out what they're going to do and try to stem losses that they're having. And then when you start to get into the longer term recovery, you really start focusing on planning. And one is small business planning, which is, there's the obvious, well, how do we get reopened? How do we as a business pivot? Because a lot of times markets change. So figuring, how do you do something different so that you can sort of adapt to the time now. But also one thing that's I think very important is to help businesses wind down. There are going to be a lot of people who were near retirement or running a business that wasn't doing too well, and they're going to maybe need to wind down. And we don't really have a lot of supports for that. Almost all of our focus is on bringing businesses back. And I think that we also need to have supports on helping businesses close so that they don't invest too much money into a business that might fail anyway, or so that they can make the best choices financially. At the same time of planning for businesses, we also should be thinking about larger economic development planning. How do we pivot our local economies so that if we were kind of in a rut and just focused on one or two industries, how do we help new industries rise up? And I think that this really necessitates investment and focus on new businesses. There's so much of a focus again on bring businesses back that we don't put as much money and emphasis on creating new businesses, filling those vacant storefronts where businesses used to be and had to close down. And then, one other thing that I'd been asked that Monica asked me to share on is just some unseen issues, or like what are the ramifications that we don't necessarily always think about. And a couple of things that I think are important are, one, home-based businesses. There's never really a lot of emphasis on home-based businesses, but especially in rural areas, so many people have little, economic activities that they run out of their home. They might have an actual, business, like they're an accountant or a massage therapist or someone who, they're running that business out of their home. But a lot of people also, they've got some chickens and they sell those eggs, or they, have some pigs, or they've got some, they go hunting and they process meat, and they might just make 5 or 10 grand a year doing this activity, but it's important for their overall income. And so, we need to be really aware of how we're supporting home-based businesses to recover. We also don't really focus a lot on subsistence issues. So a great example of this is after oil spills. When you have fisheries damaged, a lot of commercial fishermen are also subsisting off of that fish. They're sharing that fish with neighbors and friends. And there's not a really good emphasis on bringing back those those ways of subsisting that are sort of economic in one sense, but also usually depend on all kinds of natural resources. When we have a forest fire, hunting is heavily impacted. So how are we able to support families to get access to those, those foods that they used to be able to get in the forest? And then a final thing is just around recovery justice. Recovery for whom is an increasingly important question. And so some examples of that are when we rebuild housing, a lot of times we're not rebuilding housing for the people who necessarily lived there before. And part of my research at UBC is on gentrification after disasters, how that when there is rebuilding, low-income people get forced out of communities. because the rebuilding is just like, let's build new houses. It doesn't matter how much they cost when they come back on the market. We just need new housing, and there needs to be more focus on how do we actually get people back into our community with housing that they can afford, and preserve those people in place. So I mean, that's basically all the time. I think I've went over by 3 minutes. I guess just the last plug I would make is for, again, for resilience planning. There needs to be good economic resilience planning in every community to prepare for these disasters. And I think, going back to what Jeff was describing, those NEP programs, those neighborhood-based programs, they can be utilized for this sort of resilience planning. Actually send out neighborhood folks to visit their small businesses, find out what those lifeline businesses are, what they need to bring back that they depend on. And then also, are those businesses prepared? Do they have business continuity plans, et cetera? And so there can be a really great relationship that goes on between, those neighbors and their local businesses. And the same could be applied to rural areas. You could have your residents in that little region actually be reaching out to businesses that they depend on, and sort of all these communities can do mapping and see where these assets are, and then make sure that they've actually supported them. So that's it for right now. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak.